We'll try and get started again. There's one or two people just coming back. What we're going to do in this session is that rather than have a coffee break and keep you trapped here until after 4 o'clock, we're going to go right through with Stephen and his contribution, then some discussion, and then Alwyn and his contribution, and then some discussion. And once all of that is in place, questions, and then we'll get finished and you can get a coffee and escape off. I don't think there's any Champions League on tonight. Certainly not much that any of us will be watching south of Manchester, I think, for another year. Okay. Is that Katrina? We set, okay. All right. Well, welcome to this third session on looking at alternative futures, looking at the pressures and the demands in higher education from those people who employ students, from students, and also what kinds of institutions and what will be valued by whom, and the phrase adding value, which I think people will hear a bit more. So our first speaker this afternoon is Stephen Isherwood, who's the Chief Executive of the Association of Graduate Recruiters, very important to all the university and higher education systems. He was appointed to AGR in June 2013. He's been Head of Recruitment, UK and Ireland for Ernst & Young. So like our colleague from Deloitte earlier today, he's had some interesting experiences. And we look forward to your comments. Stephen, over to you. I will give you the 2-minute warnings and various other things. But,
Fantastic. Right, I'll try and rattle through these then. So, thanks for the introduction, Neil. So, just a little bit about the AGR, because I'm going to use some of our data and put it into context where our information comes from. So, Association of Graduate Recruiters. About 2/3 of our employers are now active in the school leaver market as well as the graduate market. So the fact that we talk about graduate employment, I think that's becoming a little bit of a redundant term in terms of the market that we're in. Out of our membership, we are about 300 employers, just over 90 universities, and then about 100 suppliers to the industry. We are at the structured end of the market, so you don't really become part of the AGR unless you are recruiting graduates onto a programme or students onto a programme of some description with training attracts. So we are at that higher end of the market. That doesn't mean it's always big organisations. Sometimes it's smaller organisations with large intakes where they have a high reliance, or sometimes actually it's large organisations that actually have quite a small graduate programme because it's more of a management programme, rather than sort of me and my old life at EY, where you're fueling a big engine, you're training chartered accountants to come through the system. So that's a bit about who we are. These are the figures from the recruitment season that closed last September. So this is where we ended up in terms of the market. And it was a very, very buoyant picture. This was the 4th year-on-year growth in terms of graduate vacancies, very much bouncing back post-recession. So 13.2% increase in graduate vacancies, salaries starting to creep up, average salaries stayed very flat through the recession and also afterwards, but we're now getting indications that as the market hots up, the salary pressures are creeping in. Even to intern salaries, there's so much demand for good quality internships, you'd think that actually that demand would suppress salary levels there, but competition is even increasing into that market. And again, almost 3/4 of our employers now offer internships as a way of getting talent into the business. And this growth is across the picture. The other thing I'll say on those numbers, what typically happens in a graduate year is we'll do a pulse survey, round about now, round about Christmas time. How many people are you intending to employ? And what normally happens is we get a nice, good, rosy figure, and then by summertime, actually it's tailed off, either because employers couldn't fill all their vacancies, or what normally happened, there are 1 or 2 business units who are a bit over-ambitious, and they've been told to scale back their plans. That 13.2 figure was actually an increase on the 10% figure we'd reported 6 months earlier. So totally different to a traditional market. That showed how strong demand was. It was actually increasing through the year, not backtracking slightly. But We released this data last week. So as I said, this time of year we do a pulse survey. And what we did this year is we compared some information that we collated last year on apprentice level programs. And we compared the increase in vacancies in that sector to the increase in graduate vacancies. And what you can see is the headline rates are very different. So there is still growth in the graduate market. We're not saying there's attraction, but that growth in the graduate market is only running at about 2% now across the board. Whereas last year was a bumper year, 13%. The previous 3 or 4 years were tracking at between sort of 5 and 10%, depending on the year. So what we're seeing is, well, what we appear to be seeing, because we need to do some more work now we've got the numbers to understand what's going on behind the scenes, is that graduate vacancies flattening out as more and more employers are thinking about the apprentice market and the apprentice levy and how that might reshape their behaviours. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. What I wanted to do is just paint a picture of the overall what's happening in the labour force. This came from a UK report, Supply and Demand. You may have seen it, came out just before Christmas. And this is tracking through what we're going to expect to see in terms of the labour market up until 2020. And what you can see in the data is actually, again, this shift to higher level skills. Not only to graduate, but also to that level 4, level 5 territory. And actually what the data shows is that actually the proportion of vacancies in those lower skill levels is going to decrease. So actually this demand for skills level from employers we see continuing to progress. And we see this coming through in unfilled vacancies. So we've always talked about skill shortages. We've talked about it for donkey's years. It's always been there. In fact, we probably get a little bit bored about it. But it is a reality. Absolutely is a reality. When I first took over the AGR, I didn't believe this data. I thought, oh, somebody's not counting the numbers properly. Because that figure in 2009 says that nearly 20% of AGR members didn't fill all their graduate vacancies, which doesn't really make any sense. 2009 was the kind of the depth of the slump in the graduate market. It's when graduate vacancies were at the lowest. If you remember the newspaper headlines, it was all about a lost generation, unemployed graduates, etc., etc. But we still had nearly 20% of employers who couldn't fill all their vacancies. Like I said, I didn't quite believe it because it seemed counterintuitive. So I asked a few organisations, particularly in that STEM sector, particularly engineering companies, people wanting technology skills, and they said, yep, you're right. We have not filled all our vacancies for the last 5, 6, 7 years. We just can't get the right number of people that we want for our business. And that number now has tracked back up. Actually, we've got some more recent data. It takes a little while to get this data through. There's always a sort of delay in the system. We're now running back to pre-recession levels. It's nearly 50% of our employer members are saying they're not filling all their vacancies. That doesn't mean that actually they filled most of their vacancies. It's not actually the percentage of vacancies unfilled. It's a number of employers. So it might be 1 or 2 employers. They might not fill sort of 1 or 2, 3 or 4 of their vacancies. We did some work last year to try and put a number on it. And out of 50 employers that we asked, we got to a figure pretty quickly of around about 1,400 vacancies. And I think you could quite logically extrapolate that up if you wanted to, aggregating it across a range of employers. And that was a real number. So that was 1,400 vacancies just in that sample alone that actually employs. That's jobs that were going vacant. So why is that? So employers, I'm sure as most of us know, they're looking for a combination of factors. This is me in my recruitment life. I was EY, PwC. You're looking for that mix of knowledge, skills and abilities. Most organisations get swamped by applications. The average number of applications an employer will get is around about 60 or 70 applications now. I don't like that number because it's not a very real number, because you get a lot of what I call spam applications in there, people just cutting and pasting, they don't mean very much. But it's not a problem for most employers, lack of candidates applying. It's lack of people with this key mix that employers are looking for. Because I think there's one thing that we forget about the UK market, and it is very different to most other markets around the world. Most graduate employers really do not care what somebody studied. And that's very different to continental Europe, it's very different to the US, and very different to the Far East. So me and my life at EY, about 60% of our graduate intake, the number of hires, would have had what we would have called a relevant degree. That's not all accounting and finance. We'd add maths into the mix, business, economics, those kind of degrees. But 40% had a degree that was totally unrelated to the field that they were going to work in. Now, if you take my colleague who did the same job as me in North America, I said to him once, what happens if you get a history degree coming along saying, I want to train to be a chartered accountant? He says, I tell them to go away. End of conversation. I said, you say it politely? He said, well, sort of. But he said, to be honest, they don't come and ask because the market is just not structured that way. If they've chosen to do that degree route, it's just not an option that goes through. You talk to a lawyer who's based in Germany, and again, they just find it very strange that actually people who haven't done a law degree end up in the profession in the UK. And that drives a lot of employer behaviour. If you think about how that translates to how an employer might go on campus, accountancy firms, that's my history. It'll choose an institution in the UK and it will target the entire campus. It won't go specifically to a specific course or a specific academic and work very closely. It will be targeting. So a lot of those mass market techniques are what drives employees' behaviour. But if you go back to that skills, knowledge, attributes mix, that means that an organisation is attempting to compare the potential of a history graduate, an engineering graduate, an accounting and finance graduate against each other. And that's where you get a lot of the complexities in selection coming through. Another thing I will say, just as a sideline, you talk to most organisations and a lot of them actually very much like that situation. It's not a problem for them. I speak from my own experience that quite often when you look at the profile of people 3 or 4 years in the business, it's those without a degree that's, I'm trying to avoid saying with an irrelevant degree because that sounds a really mean thing to say about somebody's education. A degree that's not relevant often are the strong performers. They stayed longer, they passed their exams with the help of BPP quicker. So employers are quite happy with that at the moment. And that's why you see a lot of marketing activities on campus, because one of the things we also don't talk about, we talk about skill shortages, there's also the preference factor. We don't do market research on students, but if you talk to organisations that do, they talk about, marketing, those kind of industries being very high on a student's radar. The number of marketing opportunities out there is probably one of the smallest sectors in the UK economy, yet it tends to appear top of the list of what students want to do. 9 times out of 10, by the way, they misunderstand what the role was because they get quite horrified when they realise they might have to do some numbers and some stats, but there we go. I don't expect to analyse these figures in detail because they're just rough estimations to give you an idea of actually why an employer might get a shortfall. So this is the example of somebody, let's say, Big Four territory. You've got looking, and this is an employer that does use academic criteria, and I know that that's starting to shift now, which I'll come back to later. But let's say you're only going to recruit people with a first or a 2-1. That immediately cuts a chunk out. You're going to set some UCAS tariff criteria. That's going to cut a chunk out. In reality, most employers aren't particularly active in the postgraduate arena. Some sectors are, pharma, those kind of sectors. They are very specific about postgrads. But again, most employers don't really care about postgraduate qualifications and certainly won't pay a premium for them. So kind of take that sector out of the market. Then you apply out of the number that's left. I've seen this cut other ways. I've seen this people just looking about, there's employers that purely go to the Russell Group. You end up with a very similar kind of scenario. But you look at the number who then want to enter the field you're in, let's say professional services, and you've actually got a smaller number saying they want to work in your sector than there are vacancies out there. So that's why you start to get into this, and that's before you've actually started looking at the kind of the skills attributes bits. That's purely looking at who's your potential target market. So that's why lots of employers invest quite heavily in campus in terms of brand attraction. And lots of employers I talk to are quite frustrated with that because it's quite a spray and pray technique. You're relying on your brand to get a whole bunch of people applying, and you're hoping that your selection system will be effective enough to pull the right people through. And I think that ties into debates around relevant degrees, degree-level apprenticeships, and actually there's a question here, is will the UK market over time start to shift more to one of those other models in other territories, whereby employers are looking more at people with a relevant degree, if they're starting to see better quality of candidates coming through those routes, if the options within those routes start to increase. I think we could be on the cusp of quite a significant shift, which I'll come back to in a minute. I won't spend time on this. You can get this anywhere. Google it. What do employers want? You always get a kind of a list like this, and I speak from somebody who's worked in recruitment for nearly 20 years, so actually, it can be sort of kind of HR speak. But what are employers really after? What do they mean when they're talking about some of these things? Well, employers want people who can get things done through other people. I was talking to an English academic at Leicester who had been to see a graduate assessment centre at one of the energy companies. And he really took away the fact that actually just taking a piece of coursework and just making it a group exercise actually did nothing to really create the kind of people working skills that we're talking about here. It's about getting things done through with other people, not just sitting around a table trying to work on one piece of work together. The employers that we talk with, they want graduates because they do want that level of intellect. They do want that level of intelligent thinking, problem solving, etc. But it has to be practical. Years ago, I was at Oxford, and Tanya, who I worked with at the Career Service, sent me a PhD mathematician. The first thing he said was, I don't want to deal with any clients, I just want you to give me problems and let me work on them. But I kind of explained that if you can't talk to your clients and articulate back to them solutions, you might have a bit of a tough time. So it is that ability to solve problems in a practical way that provides solutions to an organisation, public or private. You look at the criteria for somebody like the Civil Service Fast Stream, the NHS Management Programme. They will talk about things like commercial awareness because it's actually what's the best fit solutions for those organisations. It's things like value for money. It doesn't have to be driven purely by profit. This passion for chosen industry. It is great that students in the UK can have such a diversity of choice, but with choice can sometimes, I think, come paralysis because there's so much choice. When you're on a much firmer track, actually your options are more limited, so it's a bit more straightforward. So lots of employers talk about people coming into their pipelines who really haven't thought through the roles and haven't had direct contact with the roles. They're not sure what they're about. I joked a bit about marketing, but it's true. Most marketing roles are highly analytical nowadays. A lot of it is data crunching, whereas most people think of marketing as something quite different. My wife does freelance recruitment. She does it from home, and I hear some of the interviews through the wall sometimes that she's doing. People that have done well to get through a selection process to get to an interview, but then struggle to answer just a basic question around what a role involves. And we're also seeing, as we've come out of the recession, there is a growing shift in terms of employers looking at their criteria. So that list I had on a couple of slides ago, competency type recruitment, a list of skills. Lots of employers are trying to understand, can you measure things like resilience? Because you need people who can deal with difficult, changing situations. You need people actually that can adapt to a workplace whereby, yes, you can be doing dull work, as we all know, in almost any job. And lots of employers are finding actually a struggle to get that conversion of people adapting from student life into the world of work. And I'll come back to in a minute after this slide. This is a piece of work our research analyst did. It's not AGR data, but he pulled together data from the CBI. These were the skills that employers were saying they were least satisfied. Also some work that prospects did around actually what the skills graduates were saying they wanted, needed, once they were actually in the workplace, and how that compared to the skills they'd received on campus. And I think this is an interesting piece of data, because actually what it says to me, if you look at the bits at the bottom, the blue bars, that's what students got on campus. So you can see a lot of effort put into things like presentation skills, teamwork skills, etc. What students are saying is actually they probably didn't need as much of that now they're actually in roles. And employers are saying they just don't have a problem with those kind of skills base when employers join their organisations. But as you get into more sophisticated skills, you've got things like assertiveness training, negotiation skills. Language does get in the way here. We've got a very fractured use of language when it comes to describing skills. But I think those are the more sophisticated elements of people skills, team working skills, working together. And what both employers and students are saying is that's what they're struggling with in their first years of work. And those, I didn't put the slide into this deck, but we've got data on actually where employers are investing their money in skills training once an individual joins an organisation, and it's in that territory. Commercial awareness, I mentioned, that understanding of the business world, etc. You see that's pretty high on the agenda. And it's those kind of territories where employers are having to invest in the skills opportunities. And again, that's where I think the opportunity for employers to work more closely with institutions exist, particularly again as we start to think about things like high-level degree apprenticeships, internships, etc. Because we're dealing with this transition into work, this transition from the world of student life into the world of work. There's lots of evidence that actually young people are doing less and less work experience. They are generally more affluent than in previous decades. They don't have to do quite so much work to get the things that they might want. There also is much more focus, of course, on results, so actually less inclination to actually do something that might compromise the time that they've got to study. And that tracks through teenage years as well. Which I think fuels actually this lack of readiness for the world of work. Because if we think about actually students in the mindset they're in at the moment when they're on campus, and I'm being a little bit stereotypical here, but it's the language of the consumer, the language of debt. I was at the UK launch last night on degree level apprenticeships, and they had a speaker there who was doing a high level apprenticeship degree. And she was doing it with Nestle. And she talked about her decision-making being driven by debts. And it's interesting, the numbers they were quoting, they were actually too high, I think, the numbers they were quoting about the level of debt, but it shows that perception that can be out there. But that's the language the students getting. They're getting surveyed about student satisfaction, etc. So very much consumer language. If you think about the student journey, actually, tasks are pretty clear. Perfection is seen as the goal. So I'm not saying all students do go for a first, but that is what is that is what is rewarded. That is what is seen as the best outcome. And of course, students are in a very sort of flexible time on campus. And actually, the people they're working with mostly are people of broadly the same age and often very much the same demographic on many campuses. But you flip that to the world of work, and of course the employer is the consumer, to put it very crudely. The employer is the one that's paying the wage. As we all know in our working lives, tasks are much more ambiguous. The Rolls-Royce answer is not always the best answer, probably because it will cost too much money and take too long to achieve. And of course, tasks that you're working on, you might be part of a much bigger project, so there's much greater ambiguities. And of course, hierarchies, of course, in an employment organisation, actually the range of people you'll be working with will be significantly different. So I think if you put that kind of thought process together with the skills mix, and that's where you see these transitions coming into work. And go back to my first slide, the number of employers that are using internship vacancies is just increasing year on year. Employers are telling us their interns are more likely to stay when they get offered a full-time job, and they're more likely to be better performers. I sometimes joke, I think the answer to the skills crisis is just mandate every degree as a 4-year degree, and you have to do a 1-year placement, and we'll probably be overall in a much better place. But also as this is happening, as more employers have got more involved in the school leaver market, because it's not just the apprentice levy. Let's not kid ourselves that that's the single thing that's driving change at the moment. I take my background, the accountancy profession, 10 years ago, not many people were really active in the schools markets. My old firm certainly wasn't. But they now are, and they have been for a few years now. And you're starting to get more employers to think like this. Google, a couple of years ago, Laszlo Block had an article in the New York Times. They looked at all their analysis, and actually what their data had shown is that GPA scores were pretty useless at predicting success in an organisation. With one slight caveat, it had a minor impact where somebody had no work experience. So somebody graduating straight out of college with no work experience, there was a minor correlation. They said it's all about work experience. And when you look at what's happening with more employers in schools, having to go to a broader range of schools, a very different market, they're not filling all their vacancies, so they're going into different territories, and you're starting to see some of the science coming through around talent, you're starting to get a very different landscape on campus. I'll rattle through these very quickly because I'm conscious of time. Diversity out there. This bit here, the reason I put this slide on, so those looking at social mobility, social backgrounds, that number, it's smaller when you look at the whole diversity landscape, but that's increased by 10 basis points over the last year. So there are more and more employers. And interestingly, almost all of there is diversity. People measure what they're doing more than they actually have programs to do something about it, whereas that's flipped with social mobility. You have more employers doing something about it before they're actually finding ways to measure it. So that's increasing significantly. We also have an issue in terms of graduate program level recruitment of female graduates applying to and joining those programs. Most employers say women are more likely to get through their selection process. And we know from the Delhi data that actually female graduates are just as likely to get into graduate level employment, but for some reason they're not joining the kind of roles that the AGR represents. I used to think it's because we were skewed towards finance and those kind of sectors, or engineering, but that's not it. It is across the board. It's only the public sector, but they kind of get the same percentages as the talent pool. So there's a real issue in there about people seeing what opportunities are out there. And two last slides just to round this up, because my view is that over the next 5 to 10 years, if you think long term, I think the market could change significantly. The apprentice levy changes the way the money works. Large organisations are going to have multi-million-pound bills next year. CFOs, finance officers, COOs are going to look at their early talent recruitment in a way that they haven't before. Those organisations that may have paid a bit of lip service, left it to kind of the HR, thought, well, graduate recruitment kind of take care of itself. There was a financial mechanism that changed the nature of the landscape. Because this is a demographic issue. I've talked about demand and an increasing demand for people, for young people, etc. But this bit here at the bottom of this graph, the number of young people is declining. There was a low birth rate in the early noughties. So just as demand is increasing, we're actually getting a smaller number of young people coming through the system. And we're also seeing this is my final slide. It ties back to the UK data I highlighted earlier. This data came from the CBI, again showing the increase in opportunities is at that higher skill level end. The world is getting more sophisticated. People who don't equip themselves with the skills to get into that territory, and crucially don't maintain them through their working lives, they end up slipping back. Tomorrow's Growth, a couple of years ago by the CBI, an excellent report, talked about somebody who actually slips down the skills ladder. If they're not continuing developing, they stay down there. So I think there's pressures in the system that will drive change, will force change on both employers and institutions. I think are going to increase over the coming years. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's open the floor to discussion a bit. Paul, would you like to kick off with some responses to what Stephen was saying? Paul Ashby is from Birmingham, and his title is Head of Market Insight, isn't it? Which I don't know how you managed to get that through a university committee, but it seems quite good.
Because intelligence had already been taken.
Intelligence had already been taken.
What that boils down to is I am the marketer who decided I liked numbers and analysis, and ended up going in that direction, which is how I came to this. I feel almost as if I'm trying to answer my colleague Olivia's question from earlier about what employability actually was, and I think that expresses it very well, although I think one of the interesting things that we have to do, because I came out of marketing and recruitment and went into the role I'm in now, you can express that to a room here in terms that we can understand, but to try to express that to a 17-year-old in terms that they can understand is quite difficult. Applicants come to the sector, to universities at large and individually, they pretty much know they want to be employable when they leave in 3, 4, 5 years' time, but they don't really know what that means. So before we can convince them that we're good at it, we first have to kind of tell them what the terms of reference are. And that can be particularly challenging Perhaps in particular in the WP environment, which is sort of my background as well, if you're not from a family where the dinner table conversation is around what did middle-class mummy and daddy do at work today for 15 years, you don't have to have unemployed parents. They could be employed in a different kind of background. Those things are very unfamiliar, and why they're important is very unfamiliar. So it's very easy from one end of the sector to say it's all about employability, and employability is this, but forget when we deal with the raw material, if you like, you have to explain that and build it up from ground level. So I think that's one thing that I think is worth looking at. Another thing, perhaps slightly off this immediate topic, which I think is interesting, we subscribe to a survey of sixth formers, which has been going for some years now. And it started asking about degree apprenticeships as soon as they came on the horizon, and are you interested in them? And it consistently finds a tremendous level of latent demand. So even amongst people who have answered the question to get onto the survey, I'm probably going to university, we're getting consistently in the 40% saying, yes, I am interested. Now, what interests me about that is that it's almost exactly the same percentage as say, and I'm also very interested in studying entirely overseas, so an English language course in Holland or wherever. Now, we know that 40% actually turns into about 1% in reality. Is the degree apprenticeship 40% the same kind of 40%? Is it going to dissolve, or is it going to come through? I think that's one of the things that's vexing people a lot at the moment is, what is it that will unstick that latent demand? Is there enough out there at the moment? And from the sound of it, in terms of surety of communicating what the product is, there's an awfully long way to go.
I think it's the money. I think those of us who went through the process when they were trying to encourage diplomas in the early 2000 to 2008, 10, it was difficult. You could see people were having difficulty selling that to particular groups of students as an alternative route, a more vocational route. But accompanied by the money, the proposition that the employers will fund you through, you will be earning. We've had the first generation come out with the fees. They'll slowly be discovering that I think it was Simon said this morning, that the Treasury wanted a graduate tax. Well, the people that are repaying their loans are paying about 9%. I mean, it's quite steep. Mm-hmm. And that differential is getting into the folklore now. People are understanding it. And I suspect that will be one of the unlocking features. Mm. And that's clearly the government's view. And I was saying earlier, in the early 90s, there weren't many things that people like Michael Heseltine and Neil Kinnock were agreed on, but one of them was this kind of levy, which was one of the drivers in the German market, where because the employers had to pay, they took ownership of the system, and that's why you see so many people in Germany at the top of companies who've come right up through a process where large parts of it looked like an apprenticeship in a particular sector, even though they end up as Herr Doctor. So I think the money issue is the one that I think will surprise people more. Questions from the floor, or thoughts or contributions? Stephen, just quick catch just say who you are.
Hi, I'm Annie Hollingson from Staffs University. Stephen, would you comment on, I think there was a report from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development that mentioned you can talk about graduates in employment, but how many graduates are actually doing graduate level jobs?
Yes. So I respond politely. Well, I was quite sceptical when I saw that come out. It came out last summer. And I was quite surprised it got as much traction as it did, because it didn't paint a picture that I recognised. And talking to people like Charlie at Hexwood Prospects, who analyses all the Delhi data, people at institutions, I think there's lots of flaws in that analysis. Some of it was done in the middle of the recession. It was comparing different years. Now, there is an issue, but the fact that 60% of graduates are in non-graduate level jobs, I think, is not true. Because it's not just, Delhi is flawed. If you don't know Delhi, it's that way you're in a job 6 months after you graduated. There's been a longitudinal study. Because also, we tend to think as the first job is the graduate job, whereas actually the skills that you get through going into higher education sometimes may not kick in. Your graduate level job is often your second or third level job. So I think there's been a shrinkage of the graduate premium, but if you look at all the data that come out of the HMRC, it's still a good 20% premium on graduates. But it relates to something that I think you were saying around, one of the difficulties is that paralysis of choice is that actually it's getting messages out into the school system. Schools' careers is just so patchy and is non-existent in many areas at the moment. So actually understanding what the options are, because I think if you went into the detail of some specific degrees choices, then the problem is bigger than the overall market. One of the things that we do with the graduate market is we talk about it as a whole market. I've just spent about 20 minutes doing it. It's actually a series of very distinct, different labour markets. I talked about the 75% of employers that don't care what somebody studies. 25% do. They really care. You can only get into certain areas if you've done a very specific degree. So, but I think generally, everything I see says that CIPD report was a bit flawed.
And it's interesting, looking at the figures and what Nicola was saying this morning. I mean, the numbers are very big on apprenticeships. And if it did take off, and if it went in excess of, say, 200,000, that could make quite a dip in the recruitment pattern. So you've got a demographic dip. These people would also be on a longer process, so they wouldn't be coming through. You might have a postponement almost before the universities saw them. Combined with some other features, it could become quite challenging in terms of numbers and planning for some institutions. Is that, I mean, it just seems to me that there's a whole series of factors coming together. And of course, it won't be that everybody jumps out of a system, but it only takes a significant shift at the margin for a number of institutions and others to find themselves in difficulty.
And I think innovation will drive change and competitive advantage linked to that. So there's an employer that sits on the board of the AGR. They're developing a distance learning degree with an institution because they've got problems recruiting in rural and coastal areas. And that's a very different approach for an employer, because typically they said, we just need to spend more on marketing, to go and advertise and get more students into the pipeline. And they've gone, actually, no, that's not going to fix it, because actually the supply isn't there in the first place. So if that innovation works, that will force their competitors to do something similar. And that's where I think the money combined with innovation will actually improve the way the market functions. Again, I go back to the Big Four. Degree level partnerships, 10 years ago, there was only really PwC in the game, and now they're pretty much all doing something. And it's competition and market forces that have driven that to a certain extent. And the institutions that adapt, I think, adapt to that situation are the ones that will do better.
Okay. Do you think universities will get alongside employers rather than just studying what's happening, or do you think they'll actually engage and have to, go in and get their hands dirty to see what works?
I think there's as many different answers to that as there are universities. And certainly within individual universities, there's different people advocating different approaches. I think some of the universities you normally look to be interesting and innovative aren't actually necessarily the ones that we're seeing coming forward, in the first round of degree apprenticeships, which is kind of interesting. I'm waiting for the piece of research that kind of maps. I think we had those 3 reasons why universities would go into it. I'd be interested to see someone sort of trying to say, which of those is why Queen Mary are in it, which of those is why Sheffield Hallam in it, which is why Aston. There's almost a sort of game theory element to it. If enough universities come along to provide the degree, wasn't even half a degree, 40%, 30% of a degree apprenticeship, they'll work. If everybody says we're not coming in, then that market can't grow because, unless somebody else comes in to provide that size. So I don't know if there's a feeling that, if we hold back sector-wide, if we hold back, we can control the speed at which that market develops. And I don't know if, even if there is that feeling, if it will prove to be accurate.
I mean, I work in a sector in executive education, and universities did hold back out of that. Business schools stuck to traditional. Now a few of them, like Ashridge and others, are getting back into exec education, and people have realised how profitable it is. But it's a £4 billion industry in Britain outside of universities for what is clearly degree level short courses. And that is because the money was there and it wanted the flexibility. It didn't want people to disappear for a year. It had to be integrated with work. And the most expensive ones, you know, the ones that people go to Harvard and things, they can charge an absolute premium because they've got alongside business and said, yeah, we're only going to take you, we're going to cram it into 6 weeks because you can't afford to be without your executive for more than 6 weeks. And, you know, that's become a very active area at the moment. But for a long time, they stood back, but it didn't stop the sector finding, you know, because the money was there, and finding a market and finding a supplier.
Could I just make a couple of comments? Well, first one on executive education. And you mentioned Ashridge, which is part of the group that I'm a member of. Ashridge, in a sense, would dearly love not to be in executive education. And the reason is it's so volatile. I mean, once you start to get any kind of problem in the economy, the first thing that goes is executive education. And that caused Ashridge real problems, which is why they're trying to build up the work they're doing in taught postgraduate and so on. Secondly, the issue of the graduate apprenticeships. I think it was interesting what Tim was saying this morning, that going along to meetings where traditional universities are there looking at it, they're not. I mean, most of them are not getting engaged. Now, there is a limited audience for taking on degrees, graduate apprenticeships, and so on. If a lot of people do decide to go into graduate apprenticeships rather than go straight into degree programs, institutions who are not engaged are really going to start seeing big troubles, particularly the post-92s. The other thing I was interested in was your comment, Stephen, about, well, the answer, of course, jokingly, is everybody does a 4-year degree program and 1 year is in placements. I think it's interesting that my institution, about 30% of students have always done that, but with a twist. They have to learn a language and they have to study elsewhere in the world using that language. The employability and starting salaries of those students is enormous. They are incredibly in demand. And such that we're looking now at moving towards 4-year degree programs with placements, we hope, a lot of them outside the UK, but within the UK as well, because that seems to be what employers are telling us that they would like to see. Broader experienced students having experience working in an industry or whatever, and perhaps outside the UK getting language skills.
Any other questions to Stephen on? Well, let's turn to Aldwyn and hear his contribution.